Hi and welcome to Terry Talks Movies. It's a midweek video, so I am fulfilling an agreement that I've got with my subscribers and viewers. On Saturday, I bought a bunch of movies at a movie market, and I foolishly said in the video that if I get 10 people who want me to review it, I will review a particular movie. And I'm going to do that this video. And that movie is starring Dan Rowan and Dick Martin, The Maltese Bippy, from 1969. Directed by Rowan and Martin, who was one of the co-directors of some pretty good comedy movies back in the days before he made this one. He'd done Little Abner, The Court Jester, White Christmas, The Road to Hong Kong, very bad movie too, but he was one of the co-directors on that with Melvin Frank. So Rowan and Martin knew his way around comedy movies. Not sure he was given great material this time around. Now, Dan Rowan and Dick Martin were a comedy team who started out doing nightclub acts in the early 1950s and parlayed that into a television gig in the late 1960s with Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In. Laugh-In was a cultural phenomenon on American TV and in Australia too. It ran from January 22nd, 1968 to March 12th, 1973. So it had a 5-year run. And it was sketch comedy stuff, fast-paced. It was for American television in the 1960s/1970s. Quite transgressive and a little bit naughty, and they kept trying to slide things through past the censors. And in those days, the censors in America on television were so tight as they shat molecules. It was considered naughty, but if you watch it now, and you can see it on Tubi, if you have Tubi where you live, the jokes are a little bit risque, but they're very low risque for the third decade of the 21st century. The series was loosely based on Olsen and Johnson's Hell's a Poppin'. Lots of random stuff going on, lots of silliness, lots of visual gags, lots of cuts away to things. It was very hip and modern and countercultural, but in a very safe, middle-of-the-road American way. And Dan Rowan and Dick Martin were the hosts. They got to do some of the comedy stuff. They were very low-key with it, and the series was a success. It brought to people's attention people like Goldie Hawn and Ruth Buzzy and Joanne Worley and Artie Johnson and Lily Tomlin and Richard Dawson, all sorts of people like that. They got their first boost by being in Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In. And midway through the series, in 1969, Dan Rowan and Dick Martin made a movie called The Maltese Bippy, which of course is a pun on the Maltese Falcon and on one of the taglines from Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, which was, "You betcha sweet Bippy." So they decided to make this movie, and I think it's a missed opportunity, I'll be honest with you, because it was the opportunity for Rowan and Martin to do a lot edgier stuff. You got to remember, it's a feature film. It's not showing on American television with all the gatekeepers that involved. It was a feature film, and it could have been much, much naughtier and much, much edgier and much, much sharper than it actually was, which is a hell of a pity. Now, this was not their first rodeo as the stars of a feature film. 11 years before, in 1958, they made a feature film which was in black and white called Once Upon a Horse, which was a Western and had the conceit of having a whole bunch of Western stars from the silent era playing various roles in the movie itself. It also starred Martha Hyer, Lee Ferguson, Nita Talbot, James Gleason, John MacGyver's in there as well. I've actually found a copy of it, but it's such a bad VHS rip that it's unwatchable. And the first joke didn't land at all, and I couldn't tell whether it was Rowan or Martin because the video I've got of it is just that bloody bad. So I'm going to ignore that one. Once Upon a Horse is left in the scrap heap of cinema history. But the Maltese Bippy got a Warner Brothers Archive collection release, video on demand, so they basically print you out a copy when you order it back in the day. This one did not star anybody else from Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, because Dan Rowan and Dick Martin didn't want anybody else from the TV series to work on this film. They wanted it to feature them, though the headstones on a graveyard in the movie do show the names of various Hollywood movie stars who had appeared in Laugh-In. That's the only Laugh-In reference you get in this movie. Instead, you got not a bad cast. Carol Lindley, Julie Newmar playing a horny Hungarian lady, Mildred Natwick playing the housekeeper of the house that Dick Martin's character owns, Fritz Weaver, and a bunch of other very familiar faces who aren't really name value actors, but know how to play this kind of comedy. So what's it all about, Alfie? I'll read you the blurb off Wikipedia because it's a facile story. You don't really need to know much about it. Business has never been so bad for sexploitation filmmakers Sam Smith and Ernest Gray. Dan Rowan plays Sam Smith, Dick Martin plays Ernest. After their premises are busted by the authorities for non-payment of rent, the hapless pair become the prime suspects in a nearby cemetery murder, because cemetery murder is apparently a thing. The mental pressure of near destitution and criminal investigation become overwhelming for Ernest, so much so that he comes to believe that he has mutated into America's first werewolf. He begins to question whether he, or rather his lycanthropic self, might be the culprit responsible for homicides in the neighbouring graveyard. Now, the house he owns is in Flushing, New York, because Flushing apparently is funny. The house he owns is a boarding house for various people. They have all sorts of character actors in it, like Leon Askins, one of the people living in the house. Carol Lindley playing a character whose name is kind of funny. Her character name in this is Robin Sherwood. Julie Newmar and Fritz Weaver play Misha and Carlotta Ravenswood, who live next door and are Hungarians and may or may not be werewolves. The werewolf thing, by the way, is just a red herring in this movie, because what everybody is looking for is a fortune in diamonds, which have been hidden somewhere in the house. It's a very old trope and a very old plot line for a movie. Now, the bit at the start where they're doing the sexploitation filmmaking doesn't have any nudity in it. It has a woman in a bikini and Dan Rowan in a spacesuit that looks like it was borrowed from Doris Wishman's Nude on the Moon. In fact, it may have been influenced by it. So the movie has no nudity, no swearing, nothing risque in it beyond what you would get in a TV show. You got to remember, this is 1969 and things are just getting very edgy in America. Movies are showing nudity. Movies are using language. We're a year away from the F word being used in MASH. So this movie is an early 60s movie in a late 1960s milieu, and it doesn't work for that reason. It's kind of engaging. The music by Nelson Riddle is kind of cool in that very hip mid-1960s Nelson Riddle kind of way. Rowan and Martin are wearing Moss Mabry suits, so the suits are very well cut. I always like a Moss Mabry suit. I can never wear one because I don't have a figure for it. All the other actors are playing suitable to the roles. They know that this is essentially a slightly expanded sitcom of a movie. And the intention, obviously, from the studio, which was MGM, was to obviously get some bums on seats in cinemas, make a bit of money from it there, and then send it on to television for syndication. And to do that, they needed to make sure it did not have any rough edges. It didn't have the nudity, didn't have the swearing, didn't have the edgy subject matter. So it was the perfect product for that kind of process, which still exists to this day. There are still movies that turn up in a cinema for a short time and then move on to streaming services. Same methodology, same economic model, but in a much earlier decade. So how did Dan Rowan and Dick Martin play as the stars of a movie? Not great. I think Dick Martin's more suited to it. He's a more engaging character. He can do the goofy stuff. He can do the serious stuff. He can land the punchlines. In fact, when the comedy team started out, Dan Rowan was going to be the funny one and Dick Martin was the straight man. But they found it didn't work because Dick Martin couldn't remember his lines unless they were funny. So they flipped roles, and I think that was a good choice. Dick Martin could have had a better career in movies because he was engaging, he's goofy looking, he's silly. He's got like Don Knotts level talent, and he could have landed it. But there was always a low-key thing about Dan Rowan, which worked for television, and that kind of casual cigarette in hand gesturing thing. He could do that kind of thing, and it worked well. Apparently, he was a reasonable person. He didn't have the riz for cinema. The two actors can play off each other, following each other's lines and following the script, and that chemistry between them works. Dick Martin's definitely the stronger actor. Now, there is one sequence that everybody remembers in this, where there's a nightmare sequence for Ernest, where Ernest imagines he is turning into a werewolf. And they do a werewolf transformation for him, which is pretty cool. And they have the kind of muzzly werewolf makeup, which works fairly well and is quite a good appliance. And he's running around a Hollywood backlot, being chased by various people because he's a werewolf and people don't like him. And so he's got that personal paranoia. And the werewolf makeup works, and the transformation isn't 100% fantastic, but it's good enough. It reminds us of old werewolf transformations from Lon Chaney Jr. and Henry Hull in Werewolf of London and things like that. It's got that kind of nostalgia factor for the 1940s that works pretty well, even on a big screen in DVD format and DVD resolution. It works well. The makeup looks great. It's not supposed to look realistic. It's supposed to remind you of other things. There's a couple of other actors I've noted in this one. Robert Reed turns up. The father from the Brady Bunch turns up as a police detective. And he's kind of okay in there. Never liked the Brady Bunch. I could never believe in a blended family that was actually not bullshit, because part of my childhood I grew up in one. But he's in there as well. Dana Eclair turns up. Mildred Natwick playing Molly, the housekeeper, is a lot of fun. She has a couple of extra beats in there that are good. And then right at the end of the third act, most of the people in the movie are murdered in a sequence of murders where one character kills another, that character gets killed by another, and another, and another. And then, not for the first time, Rowan and Martin break the fourth wall and rewrite the script and try again a couple of times. And that kind of works. I like that fourth wall breaking. The fourth wall also gets broken right at the start of the movie, where Rowan and Martin are talking over the titles and letting people know that, yes, this is a fictional film and it's not to be taken seriously. And they're kind of okay in that part. I think that part's written well. But most of the script needed to have a little more humour and a little more edge. And more jokes, essentially. I kind of like having the copy of it now. I think that it is typical of that second or third tier Hollywood studio product of the 1960s, which was part of that process to not make the movie too edgy so that you can sell it onto TV later on and not spend too much money on it. So even if it doesn't really hit in cinemas, and this one was definitely a flop in cinemas, then it can be sold onto TV and some of the costs can be recompensed, and essentially, eventually, it makes a profit for the studio. So I like it as an artifact of that, and as an artifact of that business model, which, as I said, continues to this day. But it's not a great movie. And like a lot of films, you'll see a whole bunch of films from the 1940s like this, which are kind of B programmers. And they're designed to keep bums on seats until the main feature. And this movie feels a lot like that, even though it probably was a main feature at the time. If you see it turn up, say, on Tubi or something like that, or you find a slightly illicit copy of it, worth a watch, particularly if you're a fan of Rowan and Martin's Laughing. But I definitely think keeping the other actors from Rowan and Martin's Laughing out of this movie was a mistake. I think an ensemble movie with a lot of the actors, including Rowan and Martin, from Rowan and Martin's Laughing, would have sold incredible amounts of bums on seats. Dan Rowan and Dick Martin didn't want that. People like Goldie Hawn, who was being considered for the Carol Lindley role, went on to make Cactus Flower with Walter Matthau and never looked back. But definitely a missed opportunity. I think the script needed a few more turnarounds. I think had they got some of the writers from Rowan and Martin's Laughing to inject some life into the script, they could have done a lot better, and to put a few topical references and things like that and a little bit of edge to it. I would have liked this movie a lot more, but I don't mind it. I'm glad I've got it. It's a nostalgia thing as well. I watched Laughing when I could when I was a kid. It's not for everybody. Some people are going to get a giggle out of it. Some people won't. I talk about this a bit on the channel. It's one of those movies that you wish was better than it is. You've got goodwill towards it. You've got goodwill towards the actors in it. You've got goodwill toward the idea of it. But then it disappoints and you go, geez, I wish that was better. I would have loved it if it had been better. And that's the case with the Maltese Bippy. That's it for this time around. I've just got one movie. It is what it is. People have asked me to review it. And indeed I have. So next time around we've got Science Fiction Saturday. I'm going to do something new in that as well as an old movie. I'm going to pair an old and a new movie together. So until I get my shit together and do that, watch some good movies, watch some bad movies. Watch some movies that don't quite sock it to me. And I'll catch you next time.